The multiverse is a tapestry of infinite realities, each governed by its own immutable laws, its own definitions of power, its own pantheons of broken gods and desperate mortals. Most realities never touch. Most threads of existence run parallel, close enough to feel the heat of one another, but never crossing, never colliding. But occasionally, in moments of catastrophic desperation, when a dying soul reaches across the void with the last of its power, the tapestry tears, and something steps through that was never meant to be there. What happens when the most dangerous man who ever walked any world steps into a realm that has never known anything like him? What happens when a world drowning in political poison, supernatural dread, trust, and the approaching extinction of all living things receives a visitor who has already survived the apocalypse? Who caused one? What happens when Westeros meets Kratos? If you want to see more crossover battles and unexpected universe collisions, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and universe you'd want to see in the comments below. Let's explore the infinite together. The vulva had no name left. Names were for the living, and she had been dying for 3 days. She lay in the hollow of a collapsed longhouse, somewhere in the ruins of a Norse settlement that no map had recorded in centuries. Her fingers tracing patterns in the frost-hardened dirt that only she could read. The Norns had shown her what was coming, not just for her world, but for all worlds. She had seen the dead rising in a land across the void. A land of stone castles and iron crowns and dragons that men had foolishly convinced themselves they could control. She had seen a darkness there that was older than the castles, older than the dragons, older than the men who built their petty kingdoms on the bones of giants. And she had seen that the only thing capable of stopping it was already walking her world, already heading north, already carrying the weight of everything he had done and everything he refused to become again. She did not ask his permission. She did not have time. She poured the last of herself into the rift, a ragged, desperate tear between realms, nothing like the clean geometry of the Bifrost. And she whispered a single word as the darkness took her. Go. Kratos felt the pull before he understood it. One moment he was moving through a familiar tree line, in snow compacting under boots that had crossed every terrain from the rivers of Greece to the frozen peaks of Midgard. The next, the world folded. Not violently. More like a cloth being wrung, reality twisting around him with a pressure that pushed against his skin from every direction simultaneously. The Leviathan axe grew cold in his grip, colder than even its own frost, as though the weapon itself was confused by what was happening. The blades of chaos stirred against his back, their chains rattling once, a sound like warning. Then the cold hit him properly. Different cold. He registered it immediately. A man who had survived Helheim and the frozen wastes of Niflheim understood cold in its many textures. And this cold was wrong in a specific way. It was mortal cold, natural cold. The cold of a world without divine interference in its weather, where winter came not because a dead god's magic commanded it, but simply because the planet had tilted away from its sun and had not returned. It was the most ordinary cold he had felt in decades, and that ordinariness was its own kind of alarm. He stood still for 3 full seconds, an eternity for the Ghost of Sparta, and read his surroundings the way his son had taught him to read runes. The trees were wrong. Not Norse, not Greek, not any species he recognized from any of the 9 realms. Thick-trunked, ancient, their bark dark and heavy with decades of accumulated ice. The forest floor beneath him was dense with pine needles and frozen mud. And somewhere to the east, he turned his head slightly. He could hear the distant cry of an animal that was not a wolf, but was trying very hard to sound like one. He looked up. The sky was the right color. Gray-white, heavy with cloud, promising snow that hadn't fallen yet. One moon, positioned correctly. Stars, visible at the edges of the cloud cover, in configurations he did not recognize from any of the realms he had traveled. Another world, he thought, with the flat acceptance of a man who had been forcibly relocated by divine interference enough times to recognize the pattern. Someone moved me. The anger was there. It was always there, banked low and controlled now, nothing like the wildfire it had once been. But he set it aside. Anger was a tool. This was not the moment for it. He checked himself methodically. The Leviathan axe, all solid and responsive in his right hand, its frost runes glowing faintly against the unfamiliar dark. The blades of chaos, present on his back, their weight familiar and constant. The guardian shield, secured. His body, unmarked beyond the permanent white ash that had bonded to his skin a lifetime ago. Every scar accounted for, no new wounds from the transit. He was intact. He was armed. He was in an unknown world. He began to move north because north was where danger lived. And Kratos had learned long ago that moving toward danger was faster than waiting for it to find you. He did not get far. They came out of the trees in a loose, shambling formation. 8 of them, perhaps 9, moving with the specific wrongness that Kratos associated with things that had no business moving at all. And they were human in shape, but long past human in condition. Their skin had gone the gray-blue of deep cold, their eyes catching what little moonlight filtered through the clouds and reflecting it back as a pale, dead blue. Ice had formed in their hair, in the creases of their tattered clothing, in the joints of their fingers. They moved without sound, except for the creak of frozen joints and the soft crunch of their feet on packed snow. Kratos had killed Draugr. He had fought Hellwalkers in their thousands. He understood reanimated dead the way a carpenter understands wood, its properties, its limits, its specific way of breaking. These were not Draugr. They were something adjacent. Similar principle, different architecture. He could see it in the way they moved, coordinated without communicating, unresponding to some signal outside the visible spectrum. Something was directing them. Something distant and cold and very, very deliberate. The nearest one lunged. Kratos stepped into the attack rather than away from it, an old habit, one that had never failed him, and drove the Leviathan axe through the creature's chest with enough force to lift it off the ground. The frost runes flared. Ice exploded outward from the point of impact, spreading across the creature's torso in a cascade of crystalline blue-white. And the thing shattered. Not fell. Shattered into fragments of frozen flesh and bone that scattered across the snow like broken pottery. He recalled the axe before the pieces hit the ground. The remaining 8 stopped, tilted their heads in unison. That coordinated wrongness again, like that distant signal, and then came forward together. Kratos exhaled once through his nose. Then he went to work. The blades of chaos came off his back and ignited, their chains singing in the cold air as fire erupted along their length. Real fire, divine fire. The kind that had been forged in the depths of something far older and angrier than this world's gods had ever managed. The nearest white caught the blade across its midsection and came apart in flame and ice simultaneously as the chain's momentum carried through. 2 more went down to a single sweeping arc. The Leviathan axe returned to his hand, and he drove it into the skull of a 4th. And then he was moving through them. Not frantically, not desperately, but with the controlled efficiency of a man who had been doing this for centuries and found it no more difficult than breathing. 40 seconds, perhaps less. 8 creatures. 8 piles of frozen debris scattered across the snow of a forest in a world he had never seen before. Kratos stood in the silence that followed and looked at what remained of them. His breathing was even. The blades dimmed but did not extinguish, some instinct keeping them ready. He crouched beside the largest fragment and examined it. Ice in the bones. Unnatural cold radiating from the remains, even as they began to melt in the proximity of the chaos flame. Someone, something, had done this to these people deliberately, had taken human dead and repurposed them as weapons. He recognized the philosophy. He had met gods who thought that way. He stood, oriented himself by the stars at the cloud's edge, and continued north. Whatever was building an army of the dead in this world's cold places, it had just lost a scouting party. It would send more. They always sent more. And somewhere ahead, through the trees and the darkness and the coming snow, lights were burning against the black, torches on high walls, the warm amber of a place where living people had decided to make their stand against the long dark. Kratos moved toward them with the unhurried certainty of a man who had already ended worlds and was not particularly impressed by the one currently trying to frighten him. The walls of Winterfell were old in the way that only true defensive architecture could be. Not old like a ruin, not old like something forgotten, but old like a spine, built to hold, built to outlast the men who constructed them and the men who came after and the men who would come long after those. The stone was dark granite, quarried from the northern hills, fitted without mortar in the oldest sections, each block cut and seated with a precision that spoke of craftsmen who understood that the wall was not decoration, but doctrine. Torches burned at intervals along the battlements, throwing pools of amber light down the exterior face. And in those pools of light, Kratos could see the silhouettes of guards moving with the particular tension of men who had been told something terrible was coming and were trying very hard to believe their walls would matter. He walked out of the tree line and into the open ground before the gates without slowing. The reaction was immediate. He heard the shouts before the arrows were nocked, rapid, alarmed Westerosi common tongue that his mind processed with the same instinctive translation that had served him across the 9 realms, some fundamental layer of understanding that seemed to travel with him regardless of world. Stop, halt, hands where we can see them. What in the 7 hells? He stopped, not because the arrows concerned him, but because killing Winterfell's gate guards would complicate the next several hours unnecessarily. He stood in the torchlight, with the Leviathan axe held at his side, not raised, not threatening, and let them look at him. He understood what they were seeing. He had seen his own reflection enough times to know. A man, or something shaped like a man, standing well over 6 feet, built like a siege engine wrapped in skin. The white ash that covered him from crown to ankle gave him the appearance of something carved from pale stone, an effect heightened by his absolute stillness. The weapon in his hand pulsed with faint frost light. The chains on his back, the blades of chaos, currently dormant, caught the torchlight and threw it back in fragments. His eyes were dark and patient and completely unafraid. 3 arrows were trained on him from the wall. None were loosed, smart guards. I am not your enemy. His voice carried easily across the open ground, low and measured. I have killed 8 of your dead in your forest. There are more coming. I would speak with whoever commands this place. Silence on the wall, then urgent murmuring, then boots on stone stairs, rapid and deliberate. Jon Snow had not slept in 2 days. This was not unusual. Sleep had become a casualty of leadership, something he remembered fondly from his years as a simple man of the Night's Watch before resurrections and revelations and the crushing weight of knowing what was truly coming had made the simple act of closing his eyes feel like abandonment. He was in the great hall with Sansa and Davos when the guard came in, and he read the man's expression before a single word was spoken. Not panic. His guards had been trained past panic, or at least past showing it. This was something else. Bewilderment threaded through professional alarm. "There's a man at the gate, my lord," or something like a man. Jon was already moving. Sansa fell into step beside him. She always did now, a unity they had forged through necessity. And Davos followed with his hand near his belt, out of habit, rather than any real belief that his blade would matter against whatever had spooked a Winterfell guardsman. They saw him from the battlements first. Jon had faced giants. He had seen the dead rise and walk. He had stood in a field while dragon fire rewrote the landscape around him. He considered himself a man with a calibrated sense of scale when it came to extraordinary things. But the figure standing in the torchlight below did something to the air around it that he could not immediately name. A quality of presence that radiated outward like heat from a forge, not aggressive, not threatening in any deliberate way, but undeniable. The kind of presence that made the walls feel slightly less permanent. "He says he killed 8 whites in the Wolf's Wood," the guard reported. "Said there are more coming." "How does he know what whites are?" Sansa asked, her voice careful and precise in the way it always was when she was processing something that didn't fit her existing categories. Jon had no answer for that. He went down to the gate. They faced each other across 10 feet of frozen ground. The gate opened just enough for Jon to have stepped through while 4 crossbows held position behind him. And Jon Snow was not a small man, and he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had died and returned and made his peace with both experiences. But standing before Kratos, he was aware, with the dispassionate clarity that combat experience produced, that he was looking at something operating on a different scale entirely. Not just physically, though that was considerable. The ash-white figure before him was enormous in the way that suggested not simply size, but density. Like looking at a boulder that had learned to walk and had decided upon reflection that it preferred to remain upright. The weapon in its hand pulsed with a cold that Jon could feel from where he stood. A supernatural chill distinct from the ordinary winter air. The chains across its back had gone still, but they had the coiled readiness of something that could become very loud and very lethal with almost no warning. But it was the eyes that held Jon's attention. Dark, steady, and carrying in their depths the specific exhaustion of someone who had seen too much and survived all of it, and was no longer surprised by anything the universe chose to present. Jon recognized that look. He saw it in his own reflection sometimes. "You're not from Westeros," Jon said. It was not a question. "No." Kratos studied him with the same directness. "Then you are not a man who frightens easily." "Good. What I have to tell you requires a clear head. You said you killed whites. 8. In your forest less than a mile north of these walls. They were scouting, moving in formation, responding to a signal I could not see. Something directs them from a distance." He paused. "Something old. Something that considers itself a god." The word landed between them with weight. Jon watched Sansa appear at his shoulder. She had followed despite his unspoken preference that she remain behind the gate. And he had long since accepted that Sansa Stark went where Sansa Stark decided to go. "How do you know it thinks itself a god?" she asked. Kratos looked at her with an expression that might, in another man, have been the beginning of dark amusement. "Because I have met many gods. They all build armies the same way, with the dead when they can manage it. The living require too much convincing." Davos, standing just inside the gate, spoke quietly. "He's not wrong about that." Jon made a decision. He made it the way he made most decisions, quickly, on instinct sharpened by experience, with the full knowledge that he might be wrong, and the acceptance that waiting to be certain was a luxury the North could no longer afford. "Come inside," he said. "We'll talk properly." Kratos looked at the walls, at the crossbows, which the men holding them had the good sense to keep trained on him, despite the conversation's relatively civil tone. At the gate itself, thick oak reinforced with iron, the kind of gate that had probably held for centuries. "Your walls will not stop what is coming," he said, not unkindly, simply as fact. "But they are better than nothing. And you," he looked back at Jon, reading something in the younger man's bearing that seemed to satisfy some internal metric, "are better than the walls." He walked through the gate. The guards parted around him like water around a stone, and Kratos moved into the courtyard of Winterfell with the measured step of a man taking possession of new terrain. Not aggressively, but with a soldier's instinct for geometry and exit routes and fields of fire. He noted everything. The hot springs that kept the walls warm from within. The training yard, its weapons rack stocked with steel that was good by mortal standards. The great weirwood in the godswood, visible over the inner wall, its carved face white and watching. He stopped briefly when he saw the weirwood. The face carved into the bark was not a face he recognized, but the specific quality of age radiating from that tree, something vast and patient and connected to something beneath the earth, was something he recognized in principle. Old power, one the kind that accumulated over centuries and went quiet and was frequently mistaken for benign. He filed it away and followed Jon Snow into the great hall. Behind him, the gate closed. The crossbows lowered. The guards exchanged glances with the wide-eyed uncertainty of men who had just made a decision they couldn't take back. In the Wolf's Wood, half a mile north, the snow shifted. Beneath it, something that had lain still during the commotion began, slowly, to move. The great hall of Winterfell had hosted kings and killed some of them. Its hearths had burned through 1,000 winters, its long tables had seated armies and councils, and the quiet, devastating conversations that changed the shape of kingdoms without a single sword being drawn. The banners of House Stark hung from the rafters, gray direwolf on white field, weathered but intact, the kind of symbol that meant something to the people beneath it, precisely because it had survived being meant something to. Torches and firelight pushed the shadows back, but never fully eliminated them. In Winterfell, shadow was a permanent resident. Kratos sat at the far end of the primary table. Sat rather than stood, because he had decided the gesture would read as non-threatening, and he was capable of strategic social calculation when the situation warranted it, and regarded the people arrayed before him with the patience of a man who had negotiated with Odin himself and therefore found mortal politics relatively manageable. Jon Snow sat across from him, Sansa to his right, Davos to his left. Brienne of Tarth stood behind and to the side, one hand on her sword hilt, her eyes never leaving Kratos with a professional focus he respected. Several northern lords had gathered at a cautious distance. Lyanna Mormont among them, her 10-year-old face carrying an expression of pure, analytical intensity that Kratos found more interesting than anything the adults were projecting. "Tell us where you come from," Jon said, but he had dismissed the crossbowman from the room. Another decision Kratos had noted and approved of. A man who could clear his own security to have an honest conversation was a man with functional courage rather than merely performed confidence. "Another world," Kratos said. "Different gods, different wars. The specifics are not relevant to your immediate problem." "They're relevant to us understanding what you are," Sansa said. He looked at her steadily. She did not look away, another point in her favor. I am a man who has lived too long and killed too many gods to be frightened by the things that frighten you. That is what is relevant. He set the Leviathan axe on the table between them, not as a threat but as evidence. Its frost runes glowing softly in the firelight, its dwarven craftsmanship utterly unlike anything Westerosi metallurgy had ever produced. Your dead walk. Something commands them. It is ancient, and it believes itself beyond death. I have encountered this philosophy before. I have ended it before. The silence that followed had several textures. Jon's was thoughtful. Sansa's was calculating. Davos's was the specific silence of a practical man updating his threat assessment in real time. Lyanna Mormont broke it. You killed 8 whites by yourself, in the dark, without dragonglass. Yes. Our best fighters need dragonglass or Valyrian steel to put them down permanently. What did you use? Kratos picked up the axe and set it back down. This, and fire. He did not elaborate further, and let them wonder at the specifics. Wonder was a useful tool for maintaining strategic ambiguity in unfamiliar political terrain. The conversation lasted 2 hours. Kratos spoke economically. He always had, even before grief had compressed his personality into something denser and more deliberate. And he listened with the full attention of a man who understood that intelligence gathered in unfamiliar territory was the difference between surviving and not. He learned the shape of the political landscape the same way he learned the layout of a new battlefield. Quickly, without sentiment, filing each piece of information in the appropriate tactical category. The North, fractious, proud, united by immediate survival necessity rather than genuine loyalty to the Stark name. Useful as a defensive force, poor as a strategic one. And the South, irrelevant to the actual threat, but dangerously capable of becoming relevant in the wrong ways at the wrong moments. The kind of political noise that got people killed while they were trying to fight the actual war. The Night King. Everything Jon described aligned with what Kratos had felt emanating from the whites in the forest. Coordinated, patient, operating on a time scale that made human political maneuvering look like children arguing over toys. A general who had been preparing his campaign for thousands of years. The dragons. This gave him pause. He had no direct experience with dragons. Midgard's equivalent, the world serpent, had been an entirely different category of problem. But fire capable of incinerating armies was a variable worth tracking carefully. Valyrian steel. He examined Jon's blade when offered it. A good steel, excellent craftsmanship, the specific quality of metal that had been worked with supernatural intent. He handed it back without comment. His own weapons were superior by significant margin, but he kept that assessment internal. It was Davos who raised the question Kratos had been waiting for. The old smuggler had the instincts of a man who had survived by reading situations accurately, and he had been building to it for 20 minutes. You haven't asked about shelter or food, or whether we'll let you stay. Davos tilted his head. Most men arriving from nowhere in a strange place, that's the first thing they negotiate. I am not negotiating, Kratos said. I am informing. There is a difference. Informing us of what exactly? That the thing in your north is going to reach these walls before the season turns. Because that the force you currently have assembled is insufficient. That I will help you address this. Not because you have asked me to. Not because I have been offered anything in return. But because what your Night King is building is an abomination, and I have made it my business to end abominations. He looked around the table, meeting each set of eyes in turn with the flat certainty of a man making a statement of fact rather than a promise. I do not require your permission. I am telling you as a courtesy. Another silence. This one had a different texture, something between relief and the specific unease of people who had just realized that the most powerful thing in their immediate vicinity was operating on its own authority and had simply chosen, for now, to be cooperative about it. Jon opened his mouth. Sansa put her hand on his arm. Barely perceptibly, but Kratos caught it and spoke first. "We're grateful for the information and for what you did in the forest," she said, her voice carrying the careful precision of someone who had learned to choose every word as though it might be used against her later. "But you should know, there are others involved in this fight. A queen with dragons, alliances being negotiated. Your presence here will have implications beyond this hall. Let it." The complications arrived, as complications tended to in Westeros, in the form of religion. Melisandre had been watching from the doorway for the last 20 minutes. Kratos had been aware of her since she entered. He had learned long ago to track the specific warmth that active divine connection produced in a person, and the way a fire gave off heat even at distance, and the Red Woman radiated it with the intensity of a forge at full burn. Ruller's magic was real. He could feel it, a different flavor from anything in his experience, not the cold mechanism of the Norns, not the martial energy of Ares, not the vast architectural power of Odin, but genuinely divine in origin, channeled through human faith with the amplified fervor of someone who had given everything over to belief. She stepped into the hall when the political conversation reached a natural pause, and she looked at Kratos with an expression that he had seen on the faces of priests and oracles and seers across 3 mythological traditions. The expression that said, "I have been waiting for you. The Lord of Light has sent you," she said, and in the tone of someone confirming a long-held suspicion rather than making a new claim. Kratos looked at her with the specific patience of a man who had been told by gods was what his destiny was many times and had made a practice of rejecting those designations violently. "No god sent me," he said. "You do not know. I know what gods say when they move people like pieces." His voice was low and even, but something in its register made the torches nearest him gutter slightly, as though the air pressure in the immediate vicinity had changed. "I know the feeling of divine intention pressed against a life without consent. That is not what happened to me." He stood, which changed the geometry of the room considerably. "Whatever your God believes about my presence here, he is mistaken. I am not a tool. I am not a sign. I am not the fulfillment of a prophecy." He picked up the Leviathan axe. "I have killed things your God would call eternal. I suggest your Lord of Light choose his interpretations carefully." Melisandre did not step back. He gave her credit for that. Her eyes, dark and ancient in a way that her face did not otherwise show, moved over him with an intensity that was not worship and not fear, but something in between, something closer to the focus of a person revising a very important document in real time. "You have killed gods," she said quietly. Not a question. "Many." She was silent for a long moment. Then, with the careful deliberateness of someone making a significant concession, "Perhaps the Lord of Light does not send you. Perhaps he simply," she searched for the word, "notices you." Kratos considered this, and it was more honest than most divine representatives managed. "Tell your God that I have noticed him as well," he said, "and that I extend the same warning to him that I extend to all gods I meet." He did not elaborate on what the warning was. He did not need to. In the firelight of Winterfell's great hall, with the Leviathan axe in his hand and the blades of chaos at his back, and the white ash of a dead civilization written permanently across his skin, the warning was self-evident. "Melisandre, who had faced the darkness beyond death and returned from it and believed herself beyond surprise, found that her hands were very slightly cold. Outside the walls, in the far northern dark, something that had built its army over thousands of years raised its head and felt, for the first time in memory, on the faint edge of something it had never needed to feel before. Curiosity. Ravens traveled faster than dragons when the message was important enough. And the message that left Winterfell 3 days after Kratos' arrival was important enough. Sansa had written it herself, 3 drafts, each more carefully worded than the last, each attempting to describe the indescribable in terms that would not make the recipient dismiss it as northern hysteria or winter madness. In the end, she had settled for directness, because Daenerys Targaryen was, whatever else she might be, a woman who responded to directness better than she responded to diplomacy, wrapped in too many layers. There is a man here, unlike anything Westeros has produced. He is not from this world. He has demonstrated capabilities beyond anything we have witnessed, including the permanent destruction of whites without dragon glass or Valyrian steel. And he does not bend the knee. He does not negotiate. He is, at present, cooperative. We believe you should meet him before the long night arrives and the question of cooperation becomes academic. The Raven reached Dragonstone in 2 days. The summons came back in 1. Kratos did not go to Dragonstone because he was summoned. He went because Dragonstone had dragons, and dragons were a variable in this world's equation that he needed to evaluate personally. He had learned, at great cost over a very long time, that variables you failed to assess directly had a way of becoming the thing that killed you, or killed people near you. He was no longer willing to accept the second category. He made the journey south on horseback. The Winterfell stablemaster had offered him their largest destrier with the wide-eyed desperation of a man trying to be useful to something he didn't understand. And the horse, to its credit, adjusted to its rider within a day, with the pragmatic acceptance of an animal that had decided that cooperation was preferable to the alternative. He rode without escort. Jon had offered men. Kratos had declined with the brevity that Jon was beginning to recognize as his standard operating mode. The landscape changed as he moved south. The bone-deep cold of the north gave way to something more temperate, and the perpetual gray of the northern sky acquired, gradually, more variation. Clouds with texture, patches of watery winter sunlight, was the occasional glimpse of color in the land that the north had forgotten existed. Villages, farms in their winter dormancy, people moving about the business of ordinary survival, unaware of or choosing not to think about. Up at the vast darkness accumulating at the top of their world, he watched them with the complicated attention of a man who had destroyed a civilization and spent the remainder of his long life trying to understand what that meant about the value of the ones that survived. He had been 2 days from Dragonstone when the first dragon found him. Drogon came from the south and slightly east, dropping below the cloud line with the casual authority of a creature that had never needed to be subtle, because nothing in its experience had ever successfully threatened it. But he was enormous. Kratos registered this with the same flat, analytical attention he gave everything. Enormous in the way that demanded a recalibration of scale. The wingspan throwing a shadow across the road that was wide enough to swallow it entirely. Black scales that caught the winter light and threw it back in fragments of dark iridescence. Eyes the color of molten bronze, ancient and intelligent and completely devoid of the specific quality that separated animal from something more. Drogon circled once, then landed in the road ahead with the deliberate weight of something that wanted to be absolutely certain it had been seen. Kratos' horse stopped. Kratos did not stop. He swung down from the saddle, slapped the horse's flank once. It needed no further encouragement. and departing at speed in the direction they had come from, and stood in the road facing the dragon with the Leviathan axe loose in his grip. He and Drogon regarded each other across 30 feet of frozen road. The dragon exhaled, not fire, not yet, but heated air that steamed in the cold and carried in it the smell of sulfur and something older, something that Kratos' memory associated with divine spaces, with the breath of creatures that existed at the intersection of the natural and the supernatural. Drogon's nostrils flared. He was reading the ash-white figure before him the same way Kratos was reading him, cataloging, assessing, trying to place this thing in a known category, and failing. Kratos reached into his understanding of large, dangerous creatures with territorial instincts, made a decision. He spread his feet slightly. He squared his shoulders and met Drogon's bronze gaze with the absolute stillness of something that was not prey and intended to make that clear without escalation. 10 seconds. 20. Drogon lowered his head slightly. Not submission, nothing so simple. More like the acknowledgement one apex predator extends to another when the calculation comes back inconclusive. Then Daenerys dropped from the saddle, light and precise, and walked forward to stand at her dragon's shoulder. She was smaller than he had expected. The messengers and descriptions had implied someone whose presence filled rooms, and she did. But she was physically compact, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, wearing the cold of the road with the practiced indifference of someone who had survived worse climates than this. Her eyes moved over Kratos with an intelligence that was doing the same calculation Drogon had just performed, but with the added complexity of political and strategic layering. "You didn't stop," she said, when he landed in the road. "No. Most men would have run, or knelt. I am aware of both options." A pause. Something in her expression shifted, not softened precisely, but recalibrated. "Sansa Stark's letter described you accurately," she said. "She said you would not kneel. She is perceptive." "She is. It's one of the things I find both useful and inconvenient about her." Daenerys tilted her head, a gesture Kratos was beginning to recognize as Westerosi shorthand for an incoming pivot. "I am Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen, Queen of the—" "I know your titles," Kratos said. Not rudely, simply efficiently. "I have been in your world for 6 days. People talk, particularly about queens with dragons." Her eyes narrowed fractionally, the reflex of someone unused to being interrupted. And then, unexpectedly, the corner of her mouth moved in something that was almost amusement. "And what do they say? That you are capable and dangerous, and that you believe your destiny to be ordained." He met her gaze directly. "That last part concerns me." The almost amusement disappeared. "You question my right to the throne?" "I question anyone who believes their power is a birthright rather than a responsibility." He held her gaze without aggression, without deference. "I have met many rulers. The ones who were most certain of their destiny caused the most suffering. That is not an accusation. It is an observation." Behind her, Drogon made a sound low in his chest, not a growl, something more complex, the vocalization of a creature processing new information. Daenerys was very still for a long moment. When she spoke again, the register of her voice had changed. Something had been set aside, and what replaced it was more direct and considerably more interesting. "You've killed gods, they tell me. The Red Woman sent a message ahead. She is—" A brief pause. "Significantly unsettled by you. Which I find remarkable given that she herself is remarkable." "Gods are not what people believe them to be," Kratos said. "Power does not confer wisdom. Age does not confer righteousness. A being that demands worship is a being that needs something from you. And anything that needs something from you can be used. And anything that can be used can be ended. He watched her receive this, watched the specific quality of attention it produced in her. Not offense, not fear, but the focused stillness of someone hearing an idea that had implications she was still mapping. "You're talking about the Night King," she said finally. "Among others." The implication landed between them with precision. Daenerys Targaryen had not survived everything she had survived by failing to catch implications. She looked at him for a long moment, with the specific expression of someone who had just been handed a truth they weren't certain they wanted. "Come to Dragonstone," she said. It was not a request, but it had dropped the architecture of a command somewhere between her throat and the air. It arrived as something closer to an appeal from an equal, which he suspected cost her something. "We'll talk properly about the Night King, about what's coming." A brief pause. "About what gods are actually worth." Kratos looked at Drogon once more. The dragon looked back with those molten bronze eyes, and something passed between them. Not communication, not exactly, but the specific mutual recognition of creatures that had been weapons for so long that the line between weapon and wielder had become genuinely complicated. He began walking south, toward Dragonstone and the sea. After a moment, Drogon fell into step, or flight, above him, not escorting him, not threatening him, simply moving in the same direction for reasons that were entirely the dragon's own. Daenerys watched this for a moment, with an expression that she would later describe to no one, because she had not yet found the vocabulary for it. Then she mounted and flew ahead, because a queen did not follow. Even when the thing behind her was the most dangerous entity she had ever encountered in a life that had contained genuinely dangerous entities. She flew ahead, and she thought about what Kratos had said about destiny. And for the first time in a very long time, she thought about it without the comfortable armor of certainty. Below, on the frozen road, the Ghost of Sparta walked toward the sea. Behind him, north, the Night King's army grew by hundreds every day. Each new corpse a soldier, each new soldier a message. The message the same it had always been, patient as geological time. Everything ends. Everything joins us eventually. Kratos had heard that argument before. From Titans, from Olympians, from a world serpent large enough to encircle existence itself. He had found it unpersuasive every time. Dragonstone was built by people who understood that architecture was a form of argument. Every tower, every buttress, every carved dragon head jutting from the battlements at angles that caught the sea wind and produced a permanent low howl through the castle's upper corridors. All of it was making a claim. The claim was simple, and the same claim all such fortifications made, stripped of the aesthetic embellishment. We are serious people, and this is a serious place, and you should think carefully before deciding to be our enemy. Kratos had seen the same argument made in stone from the Aegean to the Norse coastline, and he had found it equally unconvincing in every instance, because the people who built walls to make statements about their power were invariably less dangerous than the people who built nothing at all, and simply were. He noted the dragon skulls in the throne room. Massive, ancient, the bones of creatures that had been dead long enough to calcify into something closer to architecture than remains. He noted the painted table, the topographical map of Westeros carved in obsidian-veined stone, its surface marked with the current disposition of forces and territories in the ongoing political war that the people of this continent had apparently decided was more important than the extinction-level event accumulating in their north. He noted the way Daenerys' advisors arranged themselves in the room. Tyrion Lannister to her left, compact and watchful behind eyes that missed nothing. Varys at a slight distance, the specific positioning of a man who liked having the exit in his peripheral vision. Missandei close, but not defensive. Her composure the earned kind, rather than the performed kind. He noted all of this and said nothing, because information gathered in silence was always more accurate than information gathered through conversation. And he had not yet decided how honest he was going to be with this particular queen about the full scope of what he represented. Tyrion Lannister was, Kratos decided within the first 20 minutes, the most genuinely intelligent person he had met in Westeros. This was not a charitable assessment offered to compensate for physical stature or political disadvantage. It was a tactical evaluation. The small man with the mismatched eyes and the wine cup he kept half full. Never empty, never full. The calibrated consumption of a man who wanted the social lubrication of drink without the cognitive cost. Had been processing Kratos since his arrival with the specific efficiency of someone who understood that what he was looking at had implications well beyond the immediate room. "You're not here to conquer," Tyrion said, at the first pause in the formal discussion. It was not a question. "You're not here to serve. You're not building toward any request that I can identify." He tilted his head. "In my experience, everyone who arrives at a queen's court wants something specific. You want..." He trailed off, the ellipsis deliberate, inviting completion. "To end the thing in your north," Kratos said. "Nothing more." "Nothing more," Tyrion repeated, as though tasting the phrase for hidden ingredients. "And that's either the most selfless thing I've ever heard or the most dangerous. And in my experience, those two categories overlap more than people like to admit." He took a measured sip of wine. "Why? You didn't choose to come here. You have no stake in our survival as a civilization." Kratos considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. He had asked himself a version of it since his first night in the Wolf's Wood, standing over the shattered remnants of 8 whites in a world that was not his own, deciding to walk toward the lights rather than away from them. "I have ended gods who built armies from the dead before," he said finally. "In my world, I have seen what follows when such things are allowed to complete their design. There is nothing after. Not tragedy, not ruins, not the romantic desolation of a fallen civilization. Nothing. The dead do not mourn. The dead do not remember. Everything that was built and struggled for and paid for in suffering simply stops." He looked at the dragon skulls on the wall. "I did not choose this world, but I am in it. And I find I am no longer capable of standing in a world that is ending and choosing not to act." The silence that followed was different from the silences in Winterfell. This one had a quality of genuine weight, the specific gravity of people in a room who have just heard something true said plainly and are adjusting to the adjustment. Daenerys spoke quietly. "Atonement." He looked at her. She met his gaze with the directness she had shown on the road, the layer of queenly performance set aside. "You're atoning for something," she said, "in your own world. Like you're trying to be something different than what you were. That's what this is." He said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower than usual, rougher at the edges in the way it only became when something true had been pressed against. "My son taught me that the past is not a chain unless you allow it to be. I am learning to believe him." He paused, but old habits require work to overcome. Acting instead of standing aside is work I am willing to do. Daenerys nodded once, slowly, with the specific acknowledgement of someone who understood the concept from the inside. The offer came from Cersei, through a proxy so insulated by layers of intermediary that the chain of deniability was almost artistic. A merchant vessel docked at Dragonstone's small harbor 3 days into Kratos' stay, ostensibly carrying Essosi wine and Myrish lace. The captain requested a private audience on behalf of an unnamed party in the capital, and Daenerys, who had not survived this long by refusing intelligence, granted it with Tyrion present and Kratos included, because she had already concluded that excluding him from information was both disrespectful and tactically pointless. The message was elegant in its construction and transparent in its intent. The unnamed party, Cersei, obviously, the fiction of anonymity maintained with the exhausted formality of a game everyone in the room knew was being played, offered 3 things. First, a cessation of southern hostility for the duration of whatever was happening in the north. Second, Lannister gold in quantities sufficient to sustain a military campaign, he delivered through the Iron Bank's Bravosi network. No questions asked regarding origin or ultimate purpose. Third, and this was the part that made Tyrion go very still, a private arrangement between the unnamed party and the ash-white northern anomaly, bypassing Targaryen authority entirely. Safe passage out of Westeros, a Lannister ship, and enough gold to begin a new existence anywhere in the known world. In exchange, Kratos' removal from the board. His departure from a conflict the unnamed party apparently found more threatening with him in it than without. Cersei, Kratos noted, was also intelligent, in a specific way. The intelligence of someone who had correctly identified the most dangerous variable in a situation and moved immediately to eliminate it. She had looked at the board that Westeros represented, seen a piece that didn't fit any established category, and concluded that removing it was worth significant cost. She was not wrong about the logic. She was wrong about the leverage. Kratos looked at the merchant captain, who had the specific pallor of a man delivering a message he understood could get him killed, and had made his peace with the risk, and said, "Tell the unnamed party that I am not a piece on her board. Tell her that I have met rulers who tried to purchase or remove threats they couldn't control, and that those conversations ended poorly for the rulers." He stood, which was always, in enclosed spaces, a statement. Tell her that if she would like to discuss the threat in the north, she may do so directly and honestly, or not at all. The captain left. Quickly, Tyrion watched him go, and then looked at Kratos with an expression approaching something that might, in other circumstances, have been friendship. You realize you've just made an enemy of the most vindictive person in Westeros. I have made enemies of gods, Kratos said. I find I have capacity remaining. Gods don't have the gold cloaks and the mountain and a talent for long, creative revenge. No, Kratos agreed. They have more than that, and I ended them regardless. He picked up the Leviathan axe from where he had set it against the table's edge, a gesture that was becoming his equivalent of punctuation, a full stop at the end of a line of reasoning. Your queen needs to know that the South will not hold its arrangement. Whatever Cersei promises, she will break when she believes it is advantageous to do so. Plan accordingly. Tyrion blinked. You're giving us strategic advice about our own political situation. Someone should. He left the room before Tyrion could formulate a response, which was, as Tyrion would later tell Varys, with the rueful admiration of one professional for another, an extremely difficult thing to do to Tyrion Lannister. Outside the battlements of Dragonstone, the sea moved against the volcanic rock in the long, indifferent rhythm of things that had been doing exactly this since before human civilization had occurred to anyone. The wind was from the north. It carried cold and the smell of coming snow, and beneath both of those, something that Kratos' specific and hard-won senses registered as the faintest trace of ice that was not weather. The Night King's reach was extending southward, Kratos stood on the battlements and felt it, and began, with the systematic thoroughness of a general who had fought wars on divine scales, to plan. The ranging party left Eastwatch by the sea on a morning when the sky was the color of old iron, and the wind came off the shivering sea with the specific malice of something that wanted to be taken personally. 7 of them in total: Jon Snow, Tormund Giantsbane, Jorah Mormont, Beric Dondarrion, Thoros of Myr, Sandor Clegane, and Kratos, moving north through the gate in the wall, with the collective atmosphere of people who had made their peace with the possibility that this was the last significant thing they would do alive. Kratos had agreed to the ranging for the same reason he agreed to most things in this world, because the direct approach was the most efficient. And the direct approach here was to go north, find the Night King's army, assess its composition and scale and the specific nature of the power directing it, and return with information that could be used. He had not agreed because Jon asked him to. He had not agreed because Daenerys, in her careful way, had suggested it would be valuable. He had agreed because he needed to see the enemy, and the enemy was north, and waiting for the enemy to come south was a philosophy he had abandoned sometime around the Third Olympian War. The wall itself he regarded with the same measuring attention he gave everything. 200 feet of solid ice, ancient beyond Westerosi reckoning, built or raised or grown. Accounts differed, with magic that was itself ancient beyond the understanding of the people it protected. He pressed one hand against it briefly as he passed through the gate tunnel, and felt what was in it: old power, slow and vast, with the kind that accumulated over millennia rather than being generated by any single divine act. Protective in intent, but the protection was keyed to something specific. Something about the nature of the dead, the specific magic that animated them. He filed this away carefully. It might matter later. North of the wall, the world became a different argument. The landscape beyond the wall was not simply cold. It was cold as a philosophical position, cold as the destination rather than the journey. Cold as the answer to questions about what the world looked like when human civilization stopped insisting on itself. The trees that survived up here were ancient and skeletal, their bark stripped by decades of wind, their branches carrying ice instead of leaves. The ground beneath the snow was permafrost, frozen so deep that digging would not reach unfrozen earth within any distance that mattered. Ravens circled at altitude, black against the iron sky, their cries flat and directionless in the dead acoustic of a landscape that absorbed sound rather than reflecting it. Tormund moved through this terrain with the ease of a man for whom the beyond the wall was simply home, reading the snow with his eyes, adjusting his route with the instinctive navigation of someone who had spent more of his life here than anywhere else. He had been studying Kratos since Eastwatch, with the frank, uncomplicated curiosity of a man who had decided that social protocol was someone else's concern. "You don't feel the cold," Tormund said on the second day, falling into step beside Kratos with the comfortable presumption of a man who made himself at home everywhere. "I feel it," Kratos said. "It does not trouble me. I've known men who said that. Most of them lied. Most men do." Tormund considered this. "You're not most men." "No." A pause. The snow crunched under their boots in the specific rhythm of two people walking in unconscious synchronization. "What are you then?" Kratos was quiet for long enough that the question might have been considered closed. Then, "Something that has been many things. Currently, a man trying to be better than what he was." He glanced sideways at Tormund. "It is more difficult than fighting gods." Tormund laughed, the full, unself-conscious laugh of a man with no relationship to embarrassment. And the sound was so incongruous in the dead northern landscape that 3 ravens startled from a nearby branch and disappeared into the gray sky. "I like you," Tormund announced. "You're honest in a way that most people who are serious aren't. Most serious people lie more than anyone." Kratos said nothing, but something in the set of his jaw shifted slightly in a direction that, in another face, might have been the early architecture of amusement. They found the army on the 4th day. They had heard it first, or rather, they had heard the absence of it, which was its own kind of sound. The wildlife beyond the wall, such as it was, had learned over millennia to read the advance of the dead, not the way prey animals read the advance of a predator, not through sound or sight, but through the complete and sudden absence of all the small, ambient noise that living things produced. The ravens were gone. The wind dropped. The snow stopped moving. The landscape ahead of them went absolutely, completely, architecturally silent. Then they crested a ridge and saw it. Even Kratos was still for a moment. The army of the dead stretched across the valley below with the patient density of something that had been accumulating for years. And it had, he reminded himself, been doing exactly that, for years, for decades. For however long the Night King had been building towards this moment. Whites, in their tens of thousands, standing in formation with the specific stillness of things that did not get tired, did not get cold, did not hunger or doubt or question. Giants among them, dead giants, lost to their blue eyes vast and empty, their scale making the human-sized dead around them look like infantry beside siege weapons. Horses, bears, things that had been animals once and were now simply mass, simply muscle and bone repurposed for a general who thought in terms of overwhelming force applied without mercy. And at their center, elevated on a ridge of ice that had not been there before, the Night King. He was visible from this distance because he wanted to be visible. This was the first thing Kratos registered. The positioning was deliberate, the elevation chosen for sight lines that worked in multiple directions simultaneously. A commander's position, but also a statement. I am here. I know you are there. I am not concerned. Kratos studied him with the specific attention he had previously reserved for gods he was planning to kill. The Night King's power was visible in the way that very concentrated supernatural force always was to someone who had spent a lifetime in proximity to it. A distortion of the air around him, subtle but present, like heat shimmer inverted. Cold radiated from him in waves that Kratos could feel even at this distance, even through his own resistance to cold, which was considerable. His eyes, when he turned his head and his face became visible across the valley's distance, were blue-white and carried in them something that Kratos recognized not as malice exactly, but as purpose. Old, absolute, cosmically patient purpose. The Night King had a philosophy. Kratos had fought gods with philosophies before. Philosophies were dangerous precisely because they gave their holders a framework that converted every action, no matter how monstrous, and into logic. How many? Jon said beside him, his voice carefully controlled. More than you can fight with what you have, Kratos said. Significantly more. But not more than the dragons can. The dragons help. They are not sufficient alone. He watched the army below with the calculating attention of someone counting not bodies, but vectors of attack, choke points, the specific geometry of a force designed to overwhelm through mass rather than precision. He does not fight the way your human generals fight. He does not seek victory. He seeks completion. There is a difference. What's the difference? Beric asked. A general who seeks victory will adapt when his strategy fails. A being that seeks completion will not adapt. It will simply continue. Kratos paused. That is both his weakness and the reason he is more dangerous than any army you have faced. He will not stop. He cannot conceive of stopping. The only response to that is to remove the source of the directive. Kill the Night King, Jon said. We know. Everything dies with him. Yes, but killing him will not be what you expect. Kratos had not taken his eyes off the figure on the ice ridge. He is not a man who has been granted power. He is power that has been pressed into the shape of a man. The distinction matters when you are planning how to end something. Below, the Night King turned his head. Across the valley, across the distance that should have made individual observation impossible, he looked directly at the ridge where they stood. Directly at Kratos. And then he did something that made every member of the ranging party step back involuntarily, made Tormund's hand go to his axe, made Jon's fingers close on Longclaw's hilt. He raised one hand, not in command, not in threat, in acknowledgement. Kratos did not step back. He stood on the ridge in the dead northern silence and held the Night King's gaze across the valley with the flat, patient certainty of a man who had stared into the eyes of Ares and Zeus and Balder and Odin and had not looked away from any of them. He had expected power. He had expected ancient, terrible, purposeful power. He had not expected recognition. Not the recognition of a predator identifying prey. Something older than that. Something that sent a signal up through his soldier's instincts and his god-killer's experience simultaneously. A signal that he had felt only a handful of times in his very long life. The Night King recognized him as an equal. Kratos filed this information away in the part of his mind reserved for facts that changed everything, and began the walk back south. Back toward the wall. Back toward the living world that didn't yet understand what it was facing. Behind him, 50,000 dead stood in patient formation and waited for the general who would not stop, could not stop, would never stop. Above them all, the sky pressed down like a lid on a world that was running out of time. They made it back to the wall in 2 days instead of 4, because Kratos set the pace, and the pace he set was not one that allowed for rest beyond the minimum required to prevent the human members of the party from becoming a liability. He had said almost nothing since the ridge. The others had learned, in the way that people learn things about Kratos, through observation rather than explanation, that his silences were not absences of thought, but the opposite. He was processing, calculating, running the geometry of an impossible problem through the specific machinery of a mind that had solved impossible problems before and understood that the solution always existed somewhere in the gap between what seemed possible and what was actually required. Jon Snow walked beside him for much of the second day and did not attempt conversation, which Kratos found appropriate and respectful in equal measure. Jon had the soldier's understanding that silence between people who had faced something together was its own form of communication. A shared acknowledgement that what had been seen was real, and that speaking too quickly about real things sometimes made them smaller than they needed to remain in order to be taken seriously. It was on the evening of the second day, camped in the lee of an ice formation with the wall visible as a pale blue cliff to the south, that Beric Dondarrion sat across the fire from Kratos and said the thing that had been accumulating in the group's collective silence since the ridge. He recognized you. Yes, Kratos said. Why? Kratos looked at the fire. The flames were the orange gold of ordinary combustion, nothing like the divine fire of the blades of chaos, and he found the ordinariness of them in this extraordinary place, in this extraordinary situation. Briefly and unexpectedly grounding. Because we are the same kind of thing, he said, in the way that matters to beings like us. What kind of thing is that? Jon asked from across the fire. Kratos was quiet for long enough that the fire popped once, loudly, in the silence. Things that should not exist anymore. Things that were made for a specific purpose by forces that no longer exist themselves, and that have outlasted that purpose and continued anyway. He looked up from the fire. The Night King was made, created by the children of the forest as a weapon against men. That is your history. You know this. But a weapon that has outlasted its war does not simply stop. It finds a new war, or it becomes the war itself. And you? Beric said carefully. I was made by war, by the gods of my world, by the choices I made in service to those gods, by everything that followed those choices. A pause. I have tried to become something else. The Night King has not. He picked up the Leviathan axe and turned it once in his hands, a gesture that, with him, meant thought rather than threat. He recognized in me a being that has stood where he stands, outside the natural order, beyond ordinary death, defined by a violence so complete that it rewrote what we were, and chosen differently. He is curious about that choice. Sandor Clegane, who had been sitting at the fire's edge with the specific stillness of a man, pretending not to listen very intently, spoke without looking up. Curious. A dead god with 50,000 corpses is curious about you. Yes. Is that good or bad? Kratos considered genuinely. It means he will come himself, he said finally, rather than simply sending the army. He set the axe down. For our purposes, that is good. A general who can be drawn into direct confrontation is a general who has introduced a variable he cannot fully control. Clegane looked up then, his burned face unreadable in the firelight. You're going to use yourself as bait. I am going to make myself available as an objective, Kratos said, in the tone of a man making a distinction that mattered to him. There is a difference. Eastwatch. Then the ravens, carrying the news south. Then the hard, cold mathematics of preparation. The consensus he built over 3 days of increasingly urgent councils conducted simultaneously in Winterfell and Dragonstone via Raven was that the wall would not hold. Not because it wasn't formidable, it was enormously so, but because the Night King had demonstrated at Hardhome. And beyond that, his power had been growing. And that the magic in the wall, ancient as it was, had been constructed against a version of him that was less complete than the version that now stood at its northern face with 50,000 dead, and something that a god-killer from another world had identified as the patience of a being that had decided it was done waiting. Kratos made one recommendation and made it once, with the brevity of someone who had given commands for decades and had learned that repetition was what you did when you weren't confident in the command. Nice, and he was confident. Do not divide your forces between the political war and the real one. The South is noise, the North is extinction. Treat them accordingly. Daenerys heard this in the Great Hall of Winterfell. She had come north, finally, with her remaining 2 dragons. The castle barely containing the changed atmosphere that dragon proximity produced, and looked at Sansa with an expression that contained several days of previous negotiation compressed into a single glance. Sansa looked back with the composed acknowledgement of someone who had been saying a version of this for weeks. The alliance solidified, not out of trust, but out of the specific arithmetic of survival. Melisandre found him in the Godswood on the night before the preparations were complete. He was standing before the weirwood tree, not in worship, not in the posture of supplication that the old god's followers adopted, but in the evaluative stillness of a man taking the measure of something powerful that he hadn't yet fully categorized. The carved face looked back at him with its permanent, patient expression. red sap running from its eyes like something between weeping and bleeding. And Kratos felt again what he had felt on his first night in Winterfell. That deep, slow, geological power, connected to something beneath the earth that was vast and old, and had been watching this land the way a foundation watches a building, silently and from below. The old gods are real, Melisandre said, coming to stand beside him with the specific quiet of someone who had learned to approach powerful things slowly. As real as Ruller, as real as the Seven, and though the Seven are, she chose carefully, more complicated in their reality than their followers understand. Gods are always more complicated than their followers understand, Kratos said. Their followers require simplicity. Gods require usefulness. The relationship is transactional and has always been transactional, regardless of the theology constructed around it. You speak of gods as though they are simply powerful people, because that is what they are. Power without wisdom is simply destruction with better self-regard. He looked at the weirwood's carved face. This one is different. It does not demand. It observes. Melisandre was quiet for a moment. The Lord of Light showed me your coming, she said, but differently than she had said it in the Great Hall weeks ago. Not as proclamation, but as disclosure, and something offered rather than declared. Not as prophecy, not as destiny, as possibility, a thread in the pattern that could go many ways. Then your God is more honest than most, Kratos said. This seemed to surprise her. Most gods present possibility as certainty because certainty produces better obedience. A god that shows you possibility admits that outcomes are not fixed. That is either wisdom or weakness, and I have not yet determined which. Could it be both? He looked at her. Most true things are both. She met his gaze, and he saw in her ancient eyes, older than her face, older than her apparent form, the eyes of someone who had lived through more than any natural lifespan accommodated, a specific and genuine uncertainty that he found more trustworthy than any confidence she had previously displayed. "And I have seen you standing at the end of the long night," she said quietly. "Alone, against it, I could not see the outcome. Because the outcome has not been decided. No." She paused. "Are you afraid?" The question landed in the god's wood with the intimacy of something asked in a confessional. Kratos was still for a long moment. Above them, the weirwood's white branches moved slightly in a wind that was not quite strong enough to move them. "I have been afraid," he said finally, "of what I am capable of what I have done, of the version of myself I might return to if I stop being careful." He looked at the carved face in the tree. "The Night King does not frighten me. What frightens me is fighting without restraint and winning, and then having to look at what the winning cost." Melisandre said nothing. There was nothing useful to say to that, and she was wise enough to know it. From the north, carried on the iron wind, came a sound that was not quite a sound, more a pressure, a change in the quality of the silence, the way silence changes when something enormous begins to move through it. The army of the dead had reached the wall. In the god's wood, the weirwood's red sap ran a little faster, and the carved face that had been watching Westeros for 10,000 years looked out at the darkness with its permanent expression of something between witness and warning. Kratos picked up the Leviathan axe and walked toward the walls. Behind him, Melisandre stood in the god's wood alone and prayed. Not with the fierce certainty she had prayed with for most of her long life, but with the humbler, more honest devotion of someone who had finally, and after a century and a half, run out of certainty and found that what remained was something quieter and more durable. The Lord of Light, if he was listening, did not respond. But the fire in every hearth in Winterfell burned a degree brighter. And in the north, behind 50,000 dead, the Night King raised his hand, and the wall, ancient and vast and patient as a promise, began with a sound like the end of an era to come down. The wall came down in silence first. That was the part no one had anticipated. That something so enormous, so ancient, so permanent in the imagination of everyone who had grown up beneath its shadow, would begin its ending not with the catastrophic thunder of collapsing ice, but with a silence so complete and so wrong that it registered in the body before it registered in the mind. The torches on the battlements went out simultaneously, not snuffed by wind, just gone. The flame there and then, not there, as though light itself had reconsidered its position. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in the span of a single breath. And then the wall spoke, in the language of things that have been under unbearable pressure for a very long time and have finally reached the precise point where the pressure exceeds the structure. A sound like the world's oldest bone breaking. Then it came down. Not all of it. The Night King was precise in his destruction, which was itself terrifying, the destruction of a being that understood engineering rather than simply overwhelming things with force. A section at Eastwatch, 300 feet of ice that had stood for 8,000 years, descending in a cascade that sent a wave of frozen air south with enough force to knock men off their feet half a mile away. The breach was wide enough for an army. The army was already moving. Kratos was on the Winterfell battlements when the sound reached them, a deep, subsonic percussion that he felt in his chest rather than heard with his ears, followed by the specific quality of cold that he had learned to associate with the Night King's presence. Not weather cold, intentional cold, the cold of a will being imposed on the physical world. Below him, in the castle and the surrounding encampment, 20,000 living people began the particular controlled chaos of preparing to fight for their survival against something that outnumbered them more than 2 to 1. He had seen this before. Different world, different gods, different armies. The mathematics of desperation were universal. He went down from the battlements to work. The hours before contact were the hours that told you everything about an army. Kratos moved through the Winterfell encampment with the measuring eye of a general who had commanded forces from Sparta to the edges of Olympus, watching how men prepared, how they spoke to each other, how they handled their weapons, where their eyes went when they thought no one was observing them. Fear was not the problem. Fear was appropriate and useful, a physiological response to accurate threat assessment. The problem was the specific fear that had crossed into paralysis, the kind that made men's hands slow on their swords and their eyes go distant at the wrong moments. He addressed it the only way he knew how, not with speech. He was not a man who inspired through rhetoric and had never pretended to be, but by being visible, moving through the camp with the unhurried certainty of something that had already decided how this was going to go, and was not particularly concerned about the army coming to kill everyone. Soldiers who were afraid benefited from proximity to something that was not afraid, in the same way that a lit torch benefited people in darkness, not because it argued against the darkness, but because it simply was not the darkness. He found Jon Snow in the training yard, moving through sword forms with the focused intensity of a man spending the last quiet hour before everything getting the most out of it. Jon's technique was excellent. Kratos had assessed it on their first meeting and had not revised that assessment since. You fight well. Not well enough. No one person is ever well enough against what is coming. That is not how this fight works. He met Jon's eyes with the directness he reserved for things that needed to be said plainly. Your value in this battle is not as a singular fighter. It is as the thing that holds the center when everything is breaking. Men fight longer and harder when they can see their leader still standing. Stay visible, stay moving. And when the Night King arrives, he paused. Find me. Jon looked at him steadily. You're going for him directly. From the beginning, the army is a distraction. He knows it, and I know it. The question is which of us reaches the other's objective first. And if he reaches his objective first? Kratos said nothing. They both understood what that meant. 50,000 wights augmented by whatever Kratos could be made into. The most dangerous corpse in the history of any world. He won't, Kratos said. Not reassurance, stated intent. The dead arrived at the tree line as the last light failed. They came without sound. That was the first thing. The silence of them. The vast army moving through the darkness with the absolute quiet of things that had no breath to spend and no weight to worry about conserving. The scouts on the outer walls saw the tree line move first, saw it shift and shudder as something behind it pressed forward. And then the darkness resolved into specificity, and the specificity was worse than the dark had been. Tens of thousands. Moving in the coordinated, purposeless-looking formation that the Night King's direction produced, not chaotic, not precisely organized the way human armies organized, but flowing, like water finding the path of least resistance across terrain. And the path of least resistance was directly at Winterfell's walls. The dragons came first. Rhaegal hit the left flank with fire that turned night into noon, a column of orange-white that moved across the advancing dead with devastating efficiency. Whites igniting and collapsing in their hundreds. The ones behind walking through the burning ones without acknowledgement, without slowing, without the basic self-preservation response that made fire such an effective weapon against living things. Drogon hit the center, Daenerys low on his neck, her face illuminated by her own dragon's fire with an expression of absolute fierce purpose that Kratos, watching from the walls, unrecognized across the distance and the chaos, she was not afraid either. Good. The Dothraki charged. The Unsullied held the gates. The Northern Lord's forces took the walls. The dead reached the trench line and filled it, not crossing it, filling it, white bodies piling into the flaming trench in numbers sufficient to extinguish it through sheer mass, the dead indifferent to the burning of the dead beneath them. And the army walked across its own casualties like a bridge built of everything it had already spent. Kratos dropped from the wall, not strategically, not after calculation. He saw the trench go out, and the army begin to pour through the gap, and he was in motion before conscious decision completed, dropping 30 feet to the ground outside the walls with the impact absorption of something that had been falling from great heights for a very long time, and had made its peace with gravity. The Leviathan axe was in his hand before he landed, and the blades of chaos were off his back before he straightened, their fire erupting into the northern dark like a second dawn. And he went into the dead with everything. The next 40 minutes were not battle in any sense that required strategy. They were arithmetic. The blades of chaos burned arcs through the dead in sweeping chains of divine fire. Each pass collapsing dozens, the frost runes of the Leviathan axe shattering what the fire missed, Spartan rage held in careful reserve, a furnace banked rather than opened, available, waiting for the moment that required it rather than being spent on moments that didn't. He moved through the dead with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this for centuries and understood that efficiency was the only thing that kept a single fighter functional against numbers this size. Not strength alone, not speed alone, but the conservation of both against the specific targets that most disrupted the army's flow. Giants. He prioritized the dead giants. A living giant was a problem of scale. A dead giant was a problem of scale plus the specific absence of pain response and self-preservation that made all the dead so difficult to fight. They did not flinch from injury that would have stopped living things, did not favor wounded limbs, did not slow when damaged unless the damage was specific and terminal. He killed 4 dead giants in the first 20 minutes, each kill a significant expenditure of effort. Each kill removing from the army a weapon capable of breaching walls that human warriors could not breach. The 5th giant found him. It came from his left while he was occupied with a cluster of whites, and it was fast. Faster than dead giants should have been, which told him the Night King was directing individual attention toward him now, selecting targets specifically, which meant the Night King was watching him specifically, which meant the recognition on the ridge had developed into something with tactical expression. The giant's fist caught him across the shoulder with the force of something between a siege weapon and a natural disaster. He went sideways, not down. He'd absorbed worse from Baldur, from the world serpent, and from Zeus, but sideways, a controlled displacement rather than a fall, using the momentum to rotate and bring the Leviathan axe across in a counter that took the giant's arm off at the elbow. Ice exploded from the stump. The giant did not slow. He drove the axe into its skull from below, channeling enough frost energy to freeze the brain cavity solid, and the giant came down like a collapsing tower. He recalled the axe and looked up. The dead were everywhere. The walls were holding. He could see torches still burning on the battlements, hear the sounds of combat above. But the press outside the walls was extraordinary. The dead simply continuing forward regardless of what was destroyed ahead of them. Drogon made another pass overhead, fire washing across the field. And in the aftermath of the light, Kratos saw, at the far edge of the battlefield, beyond the advancing dead, beyond the reach of torchlight and dragonfire, the Night King, mounted on a dead horse, still watching. And beside him, the dead horse suddenly was not a horse anymore, because the Night King had ridden to the edge of the battlefield on a dead Viserion. And the ice dragon opened its mouth, and the cold blue fire it breathed was something that the living world had no category for. And it hit the eastern wall of Winterfell like the opinion of a god. The eastern wall cracked, then crumbled. The dead poured through. Kratos turned and ran, not away from the breach, toward it, and activated Spartan rage. The world went red, not the uncontrolled red of what he had once been, not the wildfire of a broken man burning everything within reach. The controlled red of everything, he was focused into the precise application of maximum force in the service of a specific objective. He hit the dead coming through the breach like a stone wall hitting water. And for 3 minutes, he was the eastern gate, the only thing standing between the flood and the castle's interior. And he held it through the application of force so concentrated and so complete that the dead directly in front of him were not simply dying, but being removed from the equation with a thoroughness that left nothing functional behind. 3 minutes. Then he pulled back from the rage deliberately, conscious choice, the hardest kind, because the rage was finite, and the Night King was still out there and he needed what remained. The breach was not held, but it was slowed. Above the battlefield, Daenerys pulled Drogon into a turn that brought him around toward the ice dragon, toward Viserion, toward her own child wearing death like a mask. And her face in the dragonfire's light carried everything she was feeling, and had set aside in order to do what came next. On the ground, in the chaos and the blood, and the cold blue fire and the orange flame, Jon Snow was fighting his way toward the Night King with Longclaw, and the specific kind of courage that had nothing to do with the absence of fear and everything to do with moving forward despite it. And Kratos, standing in the rubble of the eastern breach with the dead pressing against him from 3 sides, looked across the battlefield at the Night King looking back at him, and understood that the moment the ridge had promised, that cold and a terrible recognition between 2 things outside the natural order, had arrived. He began moving toward it. The battlefield fell away from him as he moved. Not literally. The chaos of Winterfell's defense continued in every direction, the sounds of it enormous and layered and constant. Steel on bone and dragon fire and human voices doing the things human voices did at the edges of survival. But Kratos had a soldier's ability to narrow his operational awareness to the relevant geometry of a specific objective, filtering everything that was not the path and the target at the end of it into peripheral data rather than active processing. He had learned this in Sparta, before everything else, before gods and prophecies and the long catastrophe of his life. The fundamental military discipline of moving through chaos without being consumed by it. The dead parted around him, not because they were afraid. The dead did not fear. That was precisely the problem with them. But because the Night King was directing them away from him now, clearing a corridor through the battlefield with the deliberate precision of a being that had decided the next significant event would be a conversation rather than a melee. Kratos noted this and moved through the corridor without slowing, the Leviathan axe in his right hand and the blades of chaos trailing fire in his left. Ready, but not swinging, because he was not going to spend himself on whites when the thing that made the whites was 30 seconds ahead. The Night King dismounted from Viserion, the ice dragon landing behind the lines with a sound like a glacier shifting, and walked forward to meet him. They stopped 15 feet apart. The sounds of the battle continued behind and around them, but in the specific space between them, the air had a different quality. The same quality Kratos had felt in the moments before every significant confrontation of his life. A held-breath stillness that the world produced when something irreversible was about to happen. The Night King looked at him with those ancient blue-white eyes, and Kratos looked back. No words. Neither of them were beings that led with words. Then the Night King raised both hands, and the dead on the battlefield fell. Not his army. Westeros is dead. Every man and woman and child who had died tonight in the defense of Winterfell. Every fallen soldier whose body was anywhere on or within the battlefield. Rose in the single fluid motion of mass reanimation, their eyes going blue-white in the darkness, their wounds irrelevant, their deaths repurposed. The Winterfell garrison doubled with its own casualties. Screams from the walls, living soldiers watching the people they had been fighting beside stand back up and turn toward them. It was the Night King's answer to Kratos' presence. Not a direct attack, a demonstration. This is what I am. This is what I do. This is why I cannot be stopped by force alone, because force feeds me. Kratos understood the message. He had a response. He threw the Leviathan axe, not at the Night King. At the ground between them, a precision throw that drove the axe into the frozen earth and detonated its frost runes at maximum output. A shockwave of supernatural cold that moved outward in a ring and struck the nearest wave of freshly risen dead simultaneously, flash freezing them where they stood. 24 whites turned to ice sculpture in a single second. He recalled the axe before the shockwave finished propagating and had it back in his hand before the frozen dead began to shatter. The Night King watched this with the expression of someone cataloging new information. Then he moved. He was fast, faster than anything that looked like a man had a right to be, moving with the specific speed of a supernatural being that had been refining its physical capabilities over thousands of years. And the spear of ice he conjured from the air itself materialized and launched in the same motion. a single fluid action that had clearly worked against every living thing it had ever been used against, because living things, however skilled, operated within the constraints of what living nervous systems could process. Kratos was not operating within those constraints. He took the spear on the Guardian shield. The impact was enormous, staggering, the supernatural force behind it making his arm go briefly numb from wrist to shoulder, and converted the momentum into a forward step rather than a backward one, closing the distance by 3 feet, and drove the shield's edge into the Night King's guard in the Spartan technique that had opened lines in divine armor before. The Night King's armor held. But he moved, a fraction, a controlled retreat, the first time he had retreated from anything in living memory, and Kratos felt the significance of it. He pressed. The blades of chaos went to work at close range, their fire meeting the Night King's cold in a visible collision at the point of contact, with steam and ice and divine flame erupting between them in a continuous detonation that lit the battlefield like a heartbeat. The Night King was strong, stronger than anything human, stronger than most divine beings Kratos had encountered, the strength of something that had been killing and absorbing and growing for millennia, and wore that accumulation in every motion. He matched Kratos' offensive force with a defensive composure that was genuinely impressive, and parried the blades with conjured ice weapons that shattered on contact, but disrupted the chain's momentum enough to create openings. They were, Kratos acknowledged grimly, comparable. Not equal. He was not equal to the Night King in the way he had not been equal to the stronger Olympians. He was simply not going to admit that the gap was sufficient to matter, but comparable. And the Night King was the apex of what this world produced. Kratos was the apex of what several worlds had tried and failed to contain. Comparable was not the same as balanced. He took a fist to the chest that caved in ground beneath his feet and sent him back 6 feet, recovered, and drove the Leviathan axe through the Night King's shoulder from underneath. Close range, where the frost energy delivered directly into supernatural flesh rather than through air. The Night King made a sound, the first sound Kratos had heard from him. Not quite pain, something more like the involuntary vocalization of a being experiencing significant damage for what might have been the first time in centuries. Ice spread from the wound, stopped. The Night King removed the axe from his own shoulder with a deliberateness that was more unnerving than any display of dramatic power, and held it for a moment, studying the runes. And then the wound closed, not healed, closed, the ice of his body simply sealing over the damage. And he returned the axe to Kratos with the specific contempt of a being demonstrating that the rules were different for him. Kratos caught the axe, calculated. He had killed gods that healed. He had killed gods that were immune to conventional damage. He had killed gods that operated outside the normal parameters of mortality. The method was always the same. Eventually, you found the specific thing that existed within them that could be ended, the thread that, when pulled, unraveled the rest. For Baldur, it had been the mistletoe, removing the invulnerability. For Zeus, it had been the blade of Olympus, a weapon forged from the same source as the power it was ending. For Odin, the blades of chaos. He stopped mid-motion as the understanding arrived, not slowly, not built through reasoning, but the sudden complete comprehension that came occasionally when a mind had been working on a problem at levels below conscious thought and had finished. The blades of chaos were forged in the underworld. They were bound to Kratos by chains that connected to death itself. Not this world's death, not the Night King's version of death, but something older. The primordial concept of death that existed before any specific mythology organized it into rules and hierarchies. The Night King was death organized into a specific form, and given purpose and direction and physical expression by the children of the forest's magic. But beneath that organization was the same fundamental reality, and the blades burned with the fire of a world that death had already claimed. He needed to end it, not wound it, not stagger it, end it. He thought of Atreus, his son's voice, specific and clear even across whatever dimensional distance separated them, speaking the things he had said in the long journey north that had constituted the most significant education of Kratos' life. "We must be better, Father. It is the only way. The only way." He activated Spartan rage for the second time, and this time he did not hold it back. He went at the Night King with everything, not as a soldier, not as a general, not as the carefully controlled man he had spent years building from the wreckage of what he had been. He went as the Ghost of Sparta, the god killer, the thing that Olympus had made and then spent a generation regretting. And he hit the Night King with 200 years of divine combat experience channeled through the specific intention of ending something that needed to be ended before it ended everyone else. The Night King fought back with everything he was. The collision of it was not describable in terms the witnesses had vocabulary for. Daenerys, pulling Drogon away from Viserion's cold fire, saw the detonation from the air, and could not immediately determine whether she was looking at two beings fighting or a weather event. Jon Snow, cutting through whites toward the same objective Kratos had already reached, saw the light of it and stopped running, because the ground between him and the Night King was no longer navigable by anything that was still interested in remaining alive. Cold fire and divine flame. Ice and the heat of a dead world's underworld. The Night King's 10,000 years of accumulated purpose against a Spartan's 200 years of refusing to be what the gods had made him. Kratos drove the blades of chaos through the Night King's chest. Both of them. Simultaneously, crossed, the way he had ended Ares, and the fire that ran up the chains was not orange now, but something without color, something that existed at the intersection of every fire that had ever burned in any world. The fire of endings, and it met the Night King's cold at the point of entry, and there was a moment, a single, crystalline, unsuspended moment, where two definitions of death occupied the same space. The Night King looked at him. In those blue-white eyes, in the last second of whatever it was that the Night King was, Kratos saw the thing that had been promised on the ridge. Not malice, not hatred. Something that had been once, before 8,000 years of singular terrible purpose, had compressed it into something unrecognizable. Grief. The children had made him from a man. The man was still in there, buried under millennia of the weapon that had been built around him. He had not chosen this any more than Kratos had chosen Sparta's service. The difference was that Kratos had gotten out. The Night King shattered. Not dramatically, not in the operatic explosion that Kratos had half expected from a being of this magnitude. He came apart in a cascade of ice that moved outward from the point where the blades had entered, the cold blue of his eyes going out like a candle. And the ice that was him became simply ice. Ordinary ice, falling in fragments that caught the torchlight and were, for one absurd moment, beautiful. Across Winterfell, the dead stopped. Every white, every raised corpse, every body that the Night King's will had been animating simultaneously collapsed. The strings cut, the puppets falling where they stood. 10,000 blue lights going out in the space of a single breath. The silence that followed the battle's noise was almost more shocking than the battle had been. Absolute, ringing. The silence of people who had been fighting for their lives, suddenly not fighting, not quite believing they were still alive. Mikast not certain what to do with the fact of continuing to exist. Kratos stood in the wreckage of the Night King and let the rage exhaust itself, feeling it drain out of him in the controlled way he had trained. Not violently, not in the collapse of someone who had spent everything, but steadily, a fire burning down to coals. He looked at the fragments of ice at his feet. He thought about the grief in those last eyes, about weapons made from men, about the difference between what you were made to be and what you chose to become. He had been thinking about that difference for years. He reached down and picked up a single fragment of ice. Smooth and pale and ordinary now, no blue light in it, no ancient purpose, just frozen water on a winter battlefield. He held it for a moment. Then he set it down carefully, the way you set down something you want to acknowledge rather than simply discard. He picked up the Leviathan axe. He walked back toward Winterfell's broken walls. Above him, Daenerys brought Drogon low over the battlefield, and the dragon's amber eyes found him in the dark and held him with the same evaluating look they had exchanged on the road south of Winterfell. Weeks ago, a lifetime ago, when the Night King's army had been a threat on a horizon rather than a field of stopped, fallen, ordinary dead. Jon Snow met him at the breach in the eastern wall, breathing hard, long-clawed dark with a substance that was not quite blood. He looked at Kratos with the expression of a man who had just witnessed something he did not have a framework for and had decided that the framework could wait. "Is it over?" Jon asked. Kratos looked at the fallen dead, at the broken wall, at the living people emerging from wherever they had made their stands, wounded, terrified, moving toward each other with the specific urgent need of people who have survived something that should have killed them and are not yet ready to stop touching proof of the living. "The long night is over," he said. He did not say, "But the South still stands. And the South has a queen who burns things. And the people who survive extinction-level events have a way of turning immediately to the next catastrophe. Because that is what people do." He did not say it, but he thought it, with the tired clarity of a man who had seen enough of civilization to know its patterns. Above the battlefield, the sky was changing, barely perceptibly, and the iron gray of the long night's permanent ceiling beginning to shift at its edges, the first suggestion of something behind the clouds that had been there all along. Light. Ordinary, unheroic, completely reliable light. The sun was rising. The sun rose over Winterfell like an apology. Not dramatically. No golden columns breaking through parted clouds, no divine benediction of warmth washing over grateful survivors. Just the slow, incremental return of light to a sky that had held it at distance for too long. Gray giving way to the pale ash white of early winter morning. And then, at the horizon's eastern edge, the specific amber of a sun that had always been there and was simply visible again. It illuminated the battlefield with the neutral honesty of daylight, which did not editorialize and did not soften. Dead things were dead. Broken things were broken. The eastern wall of Winterfell was a gap of rubble and frost, and through it the morning came in without ceremony. Kratos stood on the remains of that wall and watched it come. He had not slept. He did not require sleep the way the men around him required it. The mortal exhaustion that had taken most of Winterfell's surviving defenders into an immediate and total collapse the moment the dead stopped moving. Soldiers sitting down in the middle of what they had been doing and simply ceasing. Bodies making unilateral decisions about consciousness that overruled whatever their minds might have preferred. He had watched them go down with the attention of someone cataloging a phenomenon and had left them where they fell, understanding that sleep was the body's form of triage and that interfering with triage was always a mistake. He stood on the broken wall and thought, because thinking was what the hours after significant events required of him now, or and he had learned to give those hours what they required rather than spending them on the next thing. The Night King was gone. What that meant, structurally, for this world's understanding of death and its own supernatural architecture, he did not know and could not fully assess. He had ended a being that had been central to this world's cosmology for 8,000 years. Things with that kind of gravitational significance did not simply disappear without consequence. The absence of them changed things, sometimes in ways that took generations to become visible. He had learned this in Greece. He had learned it again in the north. You ended a divine system, and the space where that system had been filled with something, and what it filled with depended on what the living chose to do with the vacancy. He could not control that. He had stopped trying to control things he could not control sometime around his son's 13th year. He watched the sun continue its rise, thought about going home. The councils began that afternoon, because Westeros was a place where the machinery of political consequence operated without pause, regardless of what else had just happened. And the surviving great lords and the Dragon Queen and the king in the north and everyone with any claim to anything convened in Winterfell's great hall to begin the process of deciding what the long night's ending meant for the long day's order. Kratos attended. He sat at the end of the table, the same position he had occupied on his first night, which felt like a different era, which it was, and listened to them arrange themselves around the new reality with the adaptability that humans demonstrated consistently and that he found, after everything, genuinely remarkable. They had been fighting extinction 12 hours ago. Now they were arguing about succession and territorial claims and the proper governance of a continent that had, by a margin of approximately the Ghost of Sparta, managed to still exist. He found it, in an odd way, reassuring. People who argued about the future were people who believed in it. Daenerys spoke well. He had revised his assessment of her upward several times since Dragonstone, finding in her a capacity for genuine adaptation that distinguished her from the rulers he had known who were dangerous rather than merely powerful. She had flown at her own dead child to protect the living. That was not the act of someone who prioritized destiny over reality. That was the act of someone who, when the moment required it, chose correctly. She would not always choose correctly. No ruler did. But she had demonstrated the mechanism that made correct choices possible, and that was more than most managed. Sansa would check her when she didn't. He had watched that dynamic developing for weeks and trusted its architecture. Jon Snow and the council reached the question of his lineage. The Targaryen blood that Kratos had heard discussed in urgent whispers by Davos and others since his first days at Winterfell sat with the specific uncomfortable stillness of a man being asked to want something he genuinely did not want. He wanted the North safe. He wanted the dead stayed. He had wanted those things with a clarity and a willingness to pay for them that Kratos recognized as the genuine article, the real thing, the kind of wanting that was different from ambition because it was about the objective rather than the self. What Westeros did with Jon Snow was Westeros's problem to solve. Kratos noted this and stepped back from it. Tyrion caught him after the council, in the corridor outside the Great Hall, moving with the deliberate interception of a man who had decided he wanted a conversation and was willing to arrange the geometry of a building around getting it. "You're thinking about leaving," Tyrion said. Not accusation, observation. "Yes. Can you? Go back, to wherever you came from." Kratos was quiet for a moment, and the honest answer was that he did not know. The vulva who had opened the rift was dead, her power spent in the transit. Whether another path existed back to his own world was a question that had no current answer. "I do not know," he said. Tyrion absorbed this with the equanimity of a man who had processed worse information. "What will you do if you can't?" "What I have always done." Kratos looked down the corridor, through the open door at its end to the courtyard beyond, where survivors were already beginning the work of clearing debris and tending wounded and rebuilding the things that had been broken. Continue. A man with your capabilities, unattached to any house or allegiance, in a continent that is about to undergo significant political reorganization. Tyrion paused to take a sip from the cup he had somehow acquired between the council room and the corridor. Is either a very valuable thing or a very dangerous one, depending entirely on the choices he makes. I am aware, Kratos said. I have been both. Which are you planning to be now? He thought about the answer seriously, because Tyrion Lannister asked questions seriously and deserved the same in return. He thought about the Night King's final eyes and the grief in them, and what it meant that even the thing he had come to this world to end had been, at its origin, something other than what it became. He thought about his son, somewhere in a world he could not currently reach, continuing the work they had begun together. He thought about the weirwood's watching face and Melisandre's fire, and the specific quality of the Westerosi dawn that was not like any dawn he had seen before, and was, despite its differences, still light. Neither, he said finally. I am planning to be useful. The distinction matters. Tyrion looked at him for a long moment, and then did something that Kratos had not previously seen him do in any of their interactions. He raised his cup in a genuine toast, without irony, without the protective coating of wit that he typically applied to moments of sincerity. To being useful, then, Tyrion said, in a world that desperately needs it. Kratos did not raise a cup. He had no cup, and would not have raised it anyway, not being a man for whom toasting came naturally. But he acknowledged the gesture with a slight inclination of his head that constituted for him significant warmth. He found Melisandre at the weirwood again, as though she had not moved since the last time, though he knew she had been everywhere during the battle, burning whites with R'hllor's fire until the fire had gone out. Not because she had been killed, but because the Night King's death had severed something in the divine connection she maintained, and R'hllor's power had gone briefly silent. And she had fought the last hour of the long night with nothing but an old woman's hands and an old woman's determination, which had been, in its own way, more than enough. She looked older this morning. The glamour that maintained her apparent youth had not reasserted itself fully since the battle, and she stood before the weirwood as the woman she actually was. Ancient, tired in the deep way of someone who had been carrying something enormous for longer than most civilizations lasted, and cautiously, tentatively relieved of a portion of it. He showed you something? She said when he stopped beside her. At the end, I saw your face. Yes. What did he show you? What he was, Kratos said, before they made him what he became. He looked at the weirwood's carved face. Grief. Melisandre was silent for a long time. Around them, the godswood was still, the winter morning coming through the weirwood's white branches and thin lines of pale light. The Lord of Light says that death is the enemy, she said finally. That everything that lives is a flame against the darkness, and that the darkness is the enemy, and that the purpose is to burn. What do you say? Kratos asked. She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. An old woman at the end of a very long road, revising a theology she had held for a century and a half in light of a night that had rewritten several of its foundational assumptions. I say that perhaps the enemy is not death itself, she said slowly. Perhaps the enemy is the refusal to let the dead rest. Perhaps the Night King was not death. She paused. Perhaps he was grief that had been given too much power and too much time. Kratos looked at her. "Perhaps," he said. He stood before the weirwood a little longer, with the red priestess, who was no longer certain what she believed, standing beside him, and the carved face watching them both. In the morning, continuing its careful advance over a world that had made it through the night. Then he picked up the Leviathan axe and walked out of the Godswood, through the courtyard where the living were rebuilding, past the training yard where Jon Snow had already resumed his sword forms. Processing, the way warriors processed, through the body rather than the mind, and out through the gates of Winterfell and into the open ground where the Wolfswood began. He stood at the tree line and looked north. The land was quiet, genuinely quiet, for the first time since he had arrived. Not the predatory silence of the dead, not the held-breath silence of people waiting to be attacked, but the ordinary silence of a winter landscape doing what winter landscapes did when nothing supernatural was organizing their atmosphere. Of birds were returning to the trees at the edge of the Wolfswood. He could hear them. He did not know if he could return home. He did not know what this continent's political reorganization would require of someone with his particular capabilities and his particular inability to ignore abominations. He did not know what Westeros would make of him in the long days ahead, whether it would find in him a useful thing or a threatening one, whether the great houses would come to see the Ghost of Sparta as an asset or a problem, whether Cersei Lannister's vindictiveness would eventually produce a confrontation he had not yet had cause to initiate. He knew none of these things. What he knew was the Wolfswood in winter morning, the weight of the Leviathan axe, the sound of birds returning to a forest that had been silent for too long, and the specific quality of light on snow when the sun was doing its work without interference. He knew that he had come to this world in someone else's desperate act, and had ended the thing that needed ending, and had not, in the process, become the thing he had once been. His son would have found something to say about that. Something precise and young and correct, in the way that the young were sometimes correct. Not through experience, but through the clarity that existed before experience complicated everything. "We must be better, Father." He turned and walked back toward Winterfell's broken walls, toward the sound of people rebuilding, toward the next thing. He was not done. He was never done. But he was, in the way that mattered most, still himself. That would have to be enough. For now, it was. The long night ended not with a prophecy fulfilled, but with a choice made. The choice of a man from another world who had no obligation to this one, who had been deposited here by a dying woman's desperate hope, and who had looked at a continent drowning in its own corruption and extinction and decided, without negotiation, without reward, that he would not stand aside. Kratos remained in Westeros, not as a king, not as a conqueror, not as the fulfillment of anyone's divine narrative. The great houses reorganized around the new political reality. Daenerys and Jon navigated the impossible geometry of their lineage and their love and their duty with the specific difficulty that impossible geometries demanded. Cersei's reckoning came, as reckonings do, on its own schedule. Through all of it, when the Ghost of Sparta moved at the edges, neither servant nor sovereign, neither weapon nor ward. A force without faction. A god-killer in a world that had needed exactly that and would need, going forward, something harder to name. In the Wolfswood sometimes, the rangers reported seeing something moving through the trees at a pace that left no trail worth following. Something that had destroyed the worst thing their world had ever produced and had not, in doing so, required anything in return. In the Godswood, the weirwood bled red into the winter snow and watched.